Alarms tore through the training dome of Kael'Theris Military Academy, red light washing over 300 cadets as smoke drones dropped from the ceiling and began firing stun bolts in tight red arcs. Bodies dove for cover. Someone screamed that the safety grid had failed. In the middle of the chaos, one cadet did not run. Mara Voss stood still, while blue stun bolts cracked past her shoulders, her eyes tracking the drones like a hawk studying insects. Around her, cadets from a dozen alien worlds scrambled behind barricades, shouting in 6 different languages, their instructors yelling conflicting orders through cracked speakers. The dome had never malfunctioned this badly before. Sparks rained from a broken support beam. A cadet named Oren Vask, a thick-boned Draxian recruit twice her size, grabbed her arm and tried to pull her toward cover. "Move! Are you insane?" he shouted, his voice cracking with real panic. Mara pulled her arm free without looking at him. She was counting the drones. 4. No, 5. One had slipped behind a collapsed barricade, reloading. She had seen worse than this before she could walk properly. On her homeworld, a broken safety system was not an emergency. It was Tuesday. The lead instructor, Sergeant Vrix Doran, watched from the elevated control platform, his 4 eyes narrowing as the situation spiraled beyond the simulation's intended parameters. He had trained soldiers for 11 coalition wars. He had seen fear, courage, foolishness, and genuine skill, and he prided himself on being able to tell them apart within seconds. But the human girl below him did not fit into any of his categories. She was not brave. Bravery required fear to overcome. She simply looked bored. "Cut the power," Vrix barked into his comm unit. "Now. Full shutdown." Below him, technicians scrambled at their consoles, but the override commands bounced back with error after error. The dome's control system, ancient and recently upgraded by a maintenance crew that clearly did not know what they were doing, refused to respond. 5 drones now hunted a room full of panicking cadets with real stun charges that, at this proximity, and this many at once, could do more than sting. A cluster of 3 or 4 hits to the same body could stop a heart. Vrix knew this. His stomach tightened with something he had not felt in years: uncertainty. Down on the floor, Mara moved. She sprinted low and fast toward the nearest fallen barricade, ignoring the shouted warnings from 2 instructors below. A stun bolt clipped the edge of her sleeve, and she barely reacted, rolling behind a support pillar and coming up already moving again. Her eyes were not on the drones that were firing. They were on the ones that were reloading, the ones with a half-second window of vulnerability that no one else in the dome seemed to notice. She grabbed a length of broken conduit pipe from the wreckage, judged its weight in half a heartbeat, and threw it with a force that made the nearest instructor's mouth fall open. The pipe struck the reloading drone's rotor housing dead center. It spun out of control, crashed into a second drone, and both dropped from the air in a shower of sparks. "She just took out 2 of them with scrap metal," an instructor muttered near Vrix, disbelief thick in his voice. Mara was already moving to the next one. She did not run in straight lines like the panicked cadets around her. She moved the way something moves when it has spent its entire life avoiding things that want to end it. Unpredictable, low, always changing direction a half-second before it would matter. A third drone locked onto her and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. She dropped flat, letting 2 bolts pass over her, and took the third across her shoulder. She grunted, rolled through the pain, and kept moving without breaking stride. Vrix leaned forward on the platform rail, his breathing suddenly shallow. He had watched veteran soldiers freeze under a single stray shot. This girl had just taken a live hit and used the momentum of her fall to close distance on her attacker. She reached the base of the 4th drone's hovering column and, with a motion too fast for most of the cadets to follow, ripped a support cable free from a damaged wall socket and used it to short the drone's targeting array. It sparked violently and dropped, dead, at her feet. 1 drone remained. It hovered near the ceiling, recalculating, its sensors sweeping the room for a new target. Mara stood in the open, chest heaving, blood beading along a shallow line on her shoulder, where the stun bolt had grazed her. She did not hide. She looked directly up at the drone, as if daring it to choose her again. It did. The final bolt streaked down. Mara sidestepped at the last possible instant, closer than any safety protocol would allow, and caught the drone's housing with both hands as it passed low over her head, using its own momentum to slam it into the floor. The impact silenced the dome entirely. Smoke curled from its shattered casing. Somewhere behind a barricade, a cadet was crying with relief. Others simply stared. For 3 full seconds, no one in the dome said a word. Then the emergency systems finally caught up, and the failsafe shutdown that should have triggered a full minute earlier finally engaged. Lights shifted from red to a calm blue. The drones that remained in their charging bay powered down. The malfunction was over. Vrix stood frozen on the platform, staring down at the girl who had just ended what could have been a genuine catastrophe using her bare hands, a length of pipe, and a torn cable. Around her, cadets slowly rose from behind their barricades, some laughing with nervous relief, others simply staring at her, the way one might stare at a creature that should not exist. Oren Vask approached her carefully, as though she might still be dangerous. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You didn't even look scared." Mara wiped a thin line of blood from her shoulder with the back of her hand and glanced at it without much interest, the way someone might glance at a scraped knee. "This wasn't anything," she said simply. The words carried through the sudden quiet of the dome, and every cadet within earshot turned to look at her. Vrix had heard many things said by recruits in his 11 wars of training soldiers. He had heard arrogance. He had heard fear disguised as confidence. He had heard cadets lie about their courage to impress their squad mates, but something about the flat, tired honesty in Mara's voice told him this was neither of those things. She was not bragging. She genuinely believed what she had said. He descended the platform stairs 2 at a time, his 4 eyes fixed on her the entire way down, already forming the questions he intended to ask. Around him, the dome's medical staff moved in with scanners, and the wreckage of 5 drones smoldered on the training floor behind her, like proof of something Vrix was not yet ready to understand. He stopped a few paces from her, taking in the shallow wound on her shoulder, the calm set of her jaw, the utter absence of fear in her posture even now, after everything. Other instructors were already whispering behind him, some in admiration, some in open suspicion. No first-year cadet moved like that. No first-year cadet fought like that. It looked less like training, and more like instinct, carved deep into bone, by years of practice no simulation could replicate. "Cadet Voss," Vrix said, his voice carrying the weight of command, even though his mind was still catching up with what he had just watched. "Report to my office after medical clears you. We need to talk." Mara met his gaze without flinching, without the nervous respect most cadets showed a senior instructor. There was no defiance in her expression either, just a strange, tired calm, the calm of someone who had faced far worse than an angry sergeant and lived to see the other side of it. "Understood, sir," she said. As the medical team guided her toward the exit, Vrix remained standing amid the wreckage, staring at the ruined drones scattered across the floor. He had built his entire career on understanding soldiers, on reading the line between skill and recklessness, between training and true danger. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not certain which side of that line the girl in front of him actually stood on. He looked down at the twisted pipe she had thrown, still lying where it had fallen, bent nearly in half from the force of the impact. No cadet in this academy's history had ever thrown anything with that kind of strength. Something about her file nagged at him now, a detail he had barely registered during her enrollment. Her homeworld had been logged under a designation he had only seen a handful of times in his career: Class Omega, unsurvivable, no return data. He had assumed it was a clerical error, or perhaps a dramatic label attached by an overcautious surveyor. To round him, medical staff finished their sweep of the dome, tagging minor injuries and clearing the last of the smoke with portable fans. A young instructor named Talia Bren approached him, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands, adrenaline still working its way out of her system. "Sir, do you want me to file this as an equipment failure, or open a full investigation?" she asked. "Command is going to want answers about how the safety override failed for that long." "Both," Vrix said, his eyes still fixed on the exit doors through which Mara had just disappeared. "But add a personnel note to the report. Cadet Voss's response to the malfunction. I want it documented in detail before anyone downplays what actually happened here." Talia glanced toward the doors as well, then back at the wreckage scattered across the floor. The bent pipe, the scorched wall socket, the fallen drones with their housings crushed by bare hands. "I've never seen a first-year move like that," she admitted. "Honestly, sir, I've never seen most of our veteran instructors move like that." "Neither have I," Vrick said quietly. He dismissed her and remained a while longer, walking slowly across the training floor, examining each disabled drone in turn, reconstructing the sequence of Mara's actions in his mind. Every choice she had made, from the throw that disabled the first two drones to the timing of her final approach, showed a level of calculated risk that should have required years of combat experience to develop. She had 6 weeks of formal training. Whatever had shaped her instincts, it had not come from anything the academy had taught her. Standing in the smoking wreckage of a training exercise that had nearly gone catastrophically wrong, he was no longer sure the designation on her file was an error at all. Vrick's office was small, lined with medals and old holographic maps of battles fought long before Mara Voss was born. She stood at attention in front of his desk, a fresh bandage taped over her shoulder, her uniform still faintly smelling of smoke from the training dome. Vrick sat behind his desk for a long moment without speaking, studying her the way he might study an unfamiliar weapon before deciding whether it was safe to hold. "Sit down," he finally said. She sat. She did not fidget. She did not glance around the room, the way most cadets did when called into an instructor's office, half searching for clues about how much trouble they were in. She simply waited, her hands folded loosely in her lap, watching him with the same patient calm she had shown while a malfunctioning drone rained stun bolts around her head an hour earlier. "Do you know how close that malfunction came to seriously hurting someone today?" Vrick asked. "Yes," Mara said. "And yet you ran directly into it, alone, without waiting for instructor support, without falling back to a defensive position like every protocol in this academy teaches. You used a piece of scrap pipe as a weapon and tore wiring out of a live wall socket with your bare hands." He leaned forward, his 4 eyes narrowing. "That is not caution, Cadet Voss. That is not discipline. That is the kind of behavior that gets soldiers killed." "It worked," Mara said simply. This time, Vrick's voice rose slightly, sharper now. "Do you understand what would have happened if you had guessed wrong about that last drone's targeting pattern? If you had misjudged the timing by even half a second?" "I didn't," she said. "That is not the point." Vrick stood, his chair scraping back against the floor, and for the first time, real frustration bled into his voice. He walked around the desk, standing over her, though she did not shrink from him the way most first-year cadets would have. "You are 18 years old. You have been at this academy for exactly 6 weeks. You are not a soldier yet. Everything that happens inside that dome, every simulation, every drill, every malfunction we throw at you, is designed to build your skills safely, one careful step at a time. It is meant to prepare you, not to be treated as though your life hangs on the outcome." He straightened, his voice carrying across the small office with the force of a man used to being obeyed without question. "This is training, not war." The words hung in the room for a moment, echoing faintly off the metal walls. Mara did not look away from him. She did not raise her voice to match his. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable, and answered with the same flat calm she had used on the training floor an hour earlier. "You're wrong." Vrick stared at her, momentarily thrown off balance by how quietly the words landed, and how completely certain she sounded saying them. He had expected an apology, or at least a flicker of doubt. Instead, he saw only the same tired steadiness she had carried since the moment he first met her. "Explain yourself," he said, folding his arms. Mara was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with more care than she had shown for anything else that day. "Where I come from, sir, there is no difference between the two. Not really. A training exercise that goes wrong and a real fight that goes wrong end the same way. Someone gets hurt, or someone doesn't. The line you're describing, the safe distance between practice and danger, it doesn't exist on my homeworld. It never has." "Every recruit says something like that during their first hard lesson," Vrick said, though his tone had lost some of its earlier heat. "Fear talks. It tells you the danger was greater than it was." "I wasn't afraid," Mara said, and something in the plainness of her voice told him she meant it exactly. "That's not bravery either, sir. Before you say it, I just don't have a separate response for danger anymore. There's only one setting. It doesn't matter if the room calls it a drill or calls it an ambush. My body doesn't know the difference, because where I grew up, it never needed to learn one. Vrix studied her for a long moment, the anger slowly draining out of his posture, replaced by something more careful, more curious. He had trained hardened soldiers from a dozen worlds who spoke about combat, with far more drama and far less honesty than the young woman sitting across from him. Your homeworld's file lists it as Class Omega, he said slowly. Unsurvivable. No return data from prior expeditions. I assumed that was an outdated classification. It isn't, Mara said. Then explain it to me, Vrix said, sitting back down, his voice quieter now, genuinely listening, rather than lecturing. Properly. Not in a training report summary. Tell me what that word actually means. Mara hesitated, her eyes drifting briefly to the old battle maps on his walls, as though measuring how much of her past she was willing to hand over to a man she had known for 6 weeks. It means gravity heavy enough to break the bones of anyone who doesn't grow up under it. It means storms that can freeze a person solid in minutes, and then burn just as fast an hour later. It means half the plants can kill you, and the other half can hurt you in ways that take days to understand. It means every single person on my homeworld learns before they can properly walk that the ground itself is not on their side. Vrix said nothing, letting her continue. There is no separate category for danger there, Mara went on. No difference between a chore and a threat. Fetching water can kill you as easily as a fight can, if you're careless, or slow, or unlucky. So when people talk about drills and real combat like they're different things, like one deserves less focus than the other, I don't know how to make my body agree with that. It was never given the option. For a long moment, Vrix simply looked at her, turning her words over in his mind, the way he might inspect an unfamiliar blade for cracks he could not yet see. He had commanded soldiers through 11 coalition campaigns. He had seen worlds ravaged by war, cities reduced to rubble, veterans hollowed out by things they had witnessed on the front lines. He thought he understood danger in every form the galaxy had to offer. He was beginning to suspect he did not. Tell me something else, Vrix said, leaning back slightly, his tone shifting from command to something closer to genuine curiosity. When that last drone locked onto you, and you stood in the open instead of taking cover, what were you thinking in that moment? Mara considered the question carefully, as though replaying the scene in her mind. I wasn't thinking about the drone, she said. I was thinking about the 4 cadets still hiding behind the far barricade. That drone's targeting system had already reset twice. If it locked onto one of them next, they wouldn't have known what to do. I did, so it made more sense for it to choose me. Vrix was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. It was not the answer of someone chasing glory or proving a point. It was pure calculation, the kind of decision made by someone who had learned to think in terms of who could best absorb a risk, rather than who wanted to avoid one. That's not how 18-year-olds usually think, he said. It's how everyone thinks where I'm from, Mara replied. You don't survive long if you only calculate for yourself. My settlement had maybe 200 people in it. Every one of us mattered to the math. If someone with more experience could take a risk, instead of someone with less, they did. Every time. It wasn't heroism. It was just arithmetic. Vrix found himself without an immediate response to that. He had spent his career teaching soldiers to value the mission above the individual, an idea that took most recruits years to internalize past a purely theoretical level. Mara spoke about it as though it were as basic as breathing, something she had never had to be taught because it had simply always been true. There's a training exercise on the schedule next cycle, he said finally, his voice careful now, testing something rather than commanding it. A live coordination drill. Larger scale than anything you've done so far. I want you placed under closer observation before it happens. Not as punishment, he added quickly, seeing the flicker of something cross her expression. As study. I want to understand what I'm actually looking at, Cadet Voss, because right now, I don't think I do. Understood, sir, Mara said, and for the first time since she had walked into his office, something like curiosity crossed her own face, brief and quickly hidden again. It seemed she was not entirely sure what to make of him either. Vrix dismissed her, and she rose, offered a short nod instead of a formal salute, and left the office without another word. He sat alone for a long while afterward, staring at the twisted piece of pipe he had ordered brought up from the training dome and placed on the corner of his desk as evidence. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, feeling the force that had bent solid metal nearly in half. Outside his window, the academy grounds stretched out under two setting suns, cadets from a dozen worlds moving between barracks and training halls, in the golden evening light, none of them aware of the conversation that had just taken place, or of the young woman walking quietly among them, who carried an entire Deathworld's worth of instinct beneath her calm, tired eyes. Vrick set the pipe down slowly, a decision forming in his mind that he was not yet ready to say aloud. If a single unarmed cadet could survive an equipment malfunction that would have overwhelmed even his most experienced squads, then perhaps everything the Academy believed about the boundary between training and real danger needed to be questioned from the ground up. He did not yet know how right he was about to be proven. That night, sleep did not come easily to Mara Voss. She lay on her narrow bunk in the cadet dormitory, staring up at the ceiling while the sounds of the academy settled into quiet around her, and her mind drifted, as it often did, back to the place she had left behind. She remembered being 6 years old, standing at the edge of her family's settlement, while her older brother Callum taught her how to read the sky. On her homeworld, the sky was never just weather. It was a warning system, and learning to read it correctly was the difference between living to see supper and not waking up the next morning. "See that color, right along the ridgeline?" Callum had said, crouching beside her, his voice low and serious, in a way that no 6-year-old anywhere else in the galaxy would ever need to hear from an older sibling. "That greenish tint means a pressure drop is coming, fast. When you see that color, you don't finish what you're doing. You don't grab your things. You run." "Run to where?" young Mara had asked. "Anywhere with rock over your head. Doesn't matter where. The temperature can drop 40 degrees in under 10 minutes when the pressure breaks like that. People who wait to see if it's really happening don't get a second chance to be wrong." She remembered nodding seriously, filing the lesson away next to 100 others just like it. How to tell which berries would feed you and which ones would stop your heart. How to walk through the bladed grass fields without letting the razor-sharp edges find bare skin. How to recognize the low humming sound that meant a ground crawler was tunneling beneath your feet, hunting by vibration, and how to freeze completely still until it lost interest and moved on. None of these lessons had been taught in a classroom. They had been taught in the middle of daily life, delivered in calm, practical voices by parents and older siblings who understood that panic killed just as efficiently as the planet itself did. Fear was allowed, hesitation was not. She remembered the day, when she was 9, that the settlement lost the Hendricks family during a routine supply run to the Eastern Ridge. Their eldest daughter, a bright, quick girl named Priya who had taught Mara how to braid rope from tough grass fibers, had misjudged the timing of a storm front by less than 15 minutes. The search party found what was left of their transport 3 days later, buried under a fresh layer of frost that had formed and shattered and reformed twice in that short window. There had been no funeral with speeches. There had been a quiet gathering, a shared meal, and a return to work the next morning, because the fields still needed tending and the water collection tanks still needed checking, regardless of grief. Mara remembered asking her mother why no one seemed angrier, why no one demanded answers about what had gone wrong. "Anger doesn't change the weather," her mother had told her, kneeling to look her directly in the eye. "The planet doesn't owe us safety, Mara. It never has. Every single day we're alive here is something we earned, not something we were given. You remember that, and you'll last a long time. You forget it, even for a moment, and you won't." Those words had settled into Mara like a second heartbeat, something she carried without needing to think about it consciously anymore. It was why, standing in the Academy's training dome earlier that day, while malfunctioning drones fired real stun charges at panicking cadets, she had not felt fear the way the others had. Her mind had simply done what it had always done. It had assessed the danger, discarded anything that wasn't useful, and acted. She thought about Sergeant Doran's question in his office, the genuine confusion in his 4 eyes when she had told him there was no meaningful difference between training and danger where she came from. She understood why the idea unsettled him. In the wider galaxy, most worlds gave their people the luxury of practice. of safe spaces to fail and learn without consequence. Her homeworld had never offered that luxury to anyone. She remembered the training her own parents had given her, the deliberate, patient repetition of survival tasks, until they became instinct rather than conscious thought. Her father, a quiet man named Elias Voss, had once spent an entire summer teaching her to throw a weighted stone with enough force and accuracy to stop a charging predator twice her size, because the settlement's supply of proper weapons was limited, and every child needed to be able to defend the herd animals if an adult wasn't nearby. "You won't have time to think when it happens," he had told her, watching her practice throw after throw until her arm ached and her palms blistered. "Thinking is slow. Your body needs to already know what to do before your mind catches up. That's the only kind of training that matters here." She had hated those lessons as a child, resented the ache in her muscles and the bruises from failed attempts. She understood now, sitting in the safety of an academy dormitory light years from home, that those brutal, repetitive lessons were the exact reason she had reacted to a malfunctioning drone with calm precision instead of panic. Her father had built something into her that no simulation, however well designed, could replicate in a cadet who had grown up somewhere safe. She remembered, too, the winter she turned 13, when a disease had swept through the settlement's herd animals, the creatures whose milk and wool made survival through the coldest months possible. Her mother had made the decision to cull half the herd before the sickness could spread further, a decision that meant less food stored for the season ahead, and a harder winter for everyone. Mara remembered arguing against it, young and certain she understood the math better than her mother did. "We need every animal we have," she had insisted. "Culling them now means we might not have enough food in 3 months. Her mother had knelt down to meet her eyes, patient despite the urgency of the moment. "And if we don't cull them, the sickness spreads to the rest of the herd within 2 weeks, and then we have no animals at all, and no food in 3 months either way, only sooner, and with nothing left to rebuild from. Waiting to see if I'm wrong isn't a plan, Mara. It's a gamble with everyone's life as the stake. I don't gamble with that." The following months had been hard, rationed carefully, everyone thinner by spring than they had been in autumn, but the herd had recovered, and no one had gone without long enough to suffer lasting harm. It had been, Mara understood much later, her first real lesson in a kind of decision-making the wider galaxy rarely demanded of anyone, choosing the harder, certain path over the easier, uncertain one, because uncertainty itself was the true danger, not the discomfort of the safer choice. She thought about that lesson now, lying in her academy bunk, and understood it was the same principle underlying every choice she had made in the training dome weeks earlier: certainty over comfort, discipline over instinct that hadn't been tested. It was not about being fearless. It was about refusing to let fear make decisions that clear thinking should make instead. She thought, too, about the day she had left. The coalition recruiter, a tall, patient woman named Odalise Wren, had visited the settlement 2 years earlier, part of an outreach program searching remote and hazardous worlds for potential recruits, with skills the wider galaxy rarely produced anymore. Most young people from safer worlds spent their childhoods being protected from harm. Odalise had come looking for someone who had grown up being taught to survive it. "Your world isn't in our official registry as inhabited," Odalise had told Mara's family, sitting at their table with a genuine, careful respect that Mara had rarely seen from outsiders. Every expedition sent to study it in the last 200 years either failed to report back or classified it unsurvivable and moved on. And yet here you are, an entire community, alive, organized, thriving in a way that shouldn't be possible, according to every survey we've ever conducted. "We don't thrive," Mara's mother had said simply. "We survive. There's a difference. Thriving implies comfort. We don't have that here. We just haven't died yet, and we intend to keep it that way." Odalise had smiled at that, a small, respectful smile. "That's exactly the kind of person the Coalition needs more of, ma'am. Worlds out there are getting more dangerous, not less. Old threats are returning. We need soldiers who understand real danger instinctively, not soldiers who've only ever practiced against simulations. Your daughter has skills that cannot be taught in any academy classroom. I'd like to offer her the chance to use them somewhere that could genuinely use her help." Mara remembered the weight of that conversation, the long nights afterwards spent deciding whether to leave the only home she had ever known. In the end, It had been her father who convinced her. "You've spent your whole life learning to survive a planet that doesn't care whether you live or die," he had told her, the night before she left, standing beneath a sky lit with the eerie green warning glow that meant a storm was still hours away, but building. Somewhere out there, people are facing dangers just as real, and they don't have what you have. Maybe it's time you let that mean something, beyond just keeping yourself alive. She had left 3 days later, carrying nothing but a single bag and a lifetime of instincts most people in the galaxy would never need and could never fully understand. Lying in her academy bunk now, months into her training, and still adjusting to a galaxy that treated danger as something optional, something scheduled and controlled and reversible, Mara understood clearly why Sergeant Doran's shouted words in his office had struck her the way they had. He believed, honestly and completely, in a line between training and war, a boundary that had protected him and his soldiers throughout his entire career. She had never been allowed the comfort of believing in that line. Where she came from, the boundary simply did not exist, and pretending otherwise, even for a moment, even inside the relative safety of a training simulation, was the kind of mistake her homeworld did not forgive. She thought about the look on his face when she had said those 2 words back to him. "You're wrong," not anger, not defiance, just fact, delivered as plainly as her mother had once explained why grief did not change the weather. She closed her eyes eventually, though sleep remained thin and shallow, old habits from a world that never allowed anyone to rest too deeply, keeping some small part of her mind alert, even here, safely behind academy walls, light years from every danger she had grown up facing. Somewhere across the academy grounds, in his own quarters, Sergeant Vrix Doran sat awake far longer than usual, turning the bent piece of pipe over in his hands again and again, trying to reconcile everything he thought he understood about training soldiers with the quiet certainty in one young woman's voice. Neither of them yet knew how soon that certainty would be tested in a way far more dangerous than any training exercise the academy had ever run. The alarm that tore through the academy 3 weeks later was nothing like the malfunction in the training dome. Mara knew the difference before her eyes were even fully open, jolted awake by a sound with a different pitch, sharper and more urgent, the kind that made every cadet in the dormitory freeze for half a second before instinct took over. "That's not a drill siren," a cadet named Farah Doyle said from the bunk across the room, her voice tight with confusion. "That's the perimeter breach alarm." Mara was already pulling on her boots, her mind moving through the same calm, practical assessment she had learned before she could properly walk. Real threat, unknown scale, move fast, move quiet, gather information before committing to action. Around her, other cadets scrambled in confusion, some assuming it was another poorly planned exercise, others already pale with real fear. Outside the academy grounds were chaos. Emergency lighting bathed the courtyards in flashing amber, and through the dormitory windows, Mara could see distant flashes near the outer wall, the unmistakable signature of weapons fire rather than training equipment. A rogue coalition faction, splintered off from the main military years earlier and never fully hunted down, had chosen this night to test the academy's defenses, gambling that a training facility running a scheduled overnight drill would be caught with its guard down. They had gambled correctly, for almost everyone except Mara. Sergeant Vrix Doran arrived at the dormitory block within minutes, his uniform half-fastened, real urgency in his 4 eyes for the first time since Mara had known him. "Listen carefully," he barked to the assembled cadets, his voice cutting through the panic with practiced authority. "This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Hostile forces have breached the outer perimeter. All cadets are to move to the underground shelter immediately. Instructors will handle." A distant explosion cut him off, close enough that the windows rattled in their frames. Several cadets flinched and cried out. Mara did not. "Sir," she said, stepping forward while the others hesitated, "how many hostiles? And what's their objective?" Vrix looked at her for a fraction of a second, something passing across his face that might have been recognition of exactly how useful her calm could be in a moment like this. "Unknown numbers. Early reports suggest they're targeting the command center and the weapons storage facility, not the cadet dormitories directly. But that could change fast if they realize how many trainees are gathered here. Then the shelter isn't the safest option if they breach further," Mara said, already thinking 3 steps ahead, in a way that made the sergeant's jaw tighten with reluctant respect. It's a single choke point. If they find it, everyone inside is trapped. The shelter has reinforced doors and its own. Another explosion, closer this time, shook dust from the ceiling. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was screaming for a medic. Vrix made a decision fast, the kind of decision that had kept him alive through 11 campaigns. Voss, with me. The rest of you, move to the shelter now, and stay together. The cadets scattered toward the underground shelter in a tight, frightened cluster, while Mara fell into step beside the sergeant, moving through the smoke-filled corridors with a steadiness that seemed to anchor him more than he expected it to. They emerged into the main courtyard just as a squad of attackers, wearing mismatched armor scavenged from a dozen different battles, breached through a service gate near the eastern wall. "Down!" Vrix shouted, pulling Mara behind a low stone barrier as weapons fire raked across the courtyard, chipping stone and scorching the ground where they had been standing a heartbeat earlier. Mara peered over the barrier, assessing the attackers with the same detached focus she had used on the malfunctioning drones weeks earlier, except now the stakes were unmistakably real. 6 visible hostiles, moving in a loose formation that suggested confidence rather than discipline. They believed they were facing an unprepared training facility, not real resistance. They were wrong. "There's a supply cart near the fountain," Mara said quietly, her eyes already tracking the attackers' movement patterns, noting who reloaded when, who covered whom, who moved carelessly into open ground. "Metal frame. If I can flip it for cover, I can draw 2 of them wide left, away from the others." "Absolutely not," Vrix snapped. "You are a cadet, not a soldier. You have 6 weeks of training. These are combatants with real experience." "They're overconfident," Mara said, her voice steady, utterly without fear, exactly the way it had been when she faced down a malfunctioning drone alone. Overconfidence gets people killed faster than skill does. I've seen that pattern before. It's how predators behave, right before they get careless. Before Vrix could argue further, a grenade landed near their position, rolling to a stop just a few feet away. Time seemed to slow. Vrix's eyes widened, his body already tensing to shove Mara clear, to take whatever came next himself the way any decent commander would for a cadet under his protection. Mara moved first. She scooped the grenade with one motion, the same economical, practiced motion she had used her whole life scooping stones to throw at charging predators, and hurled it back over the low barrier toward the attacker's position, in a single fluid arc. It detonated mid-air above them, scattering the squad, and sending 2 of them sprawling to the ground, dazed and disoriented. "Now," Mara said, already vaulting the barrier. Vrix followed her, stunned into action, more by instinct than by agreement, his training taking over, even as some part of his mind struggled to process what he had just watched a first-year cadet do, without a moment's hesitation. Mara reached the overturned supply cart and used it exactly as she had planned, drawing fire from 2 disoriented attackers, while Vrix moved to flank the remaining 4 from the side, his own decades of combat experience finally finding solid ground to stand on beside her impossible instincts. The fight that followed lasted less than 90 seconds, though it felt far longer to both of them. Mara moved through the chaos with the same unnerving calm she had shown in the training dome, disarming one attacker with a strike to the wrist that Vrix recognized as a technique born from necessity rather than formal instruction, using the man's own weapon momentarily to force the others back before Vrix's precise shots ended the exchange entirely. When it was over, 4 attackers lay incapacitated, and the remaining 2 had fled back through the breached gate, radioing frantically to whatever remained of their splinter force that the target was not the easy prize they had been promised. Silence fell over the courtyard, broken only by distant sirens and the crackle of small fires burning near the outer wall. Vrix stood over the scene, breathing hard, staring at Mara as she calmly checked a shallow cut along her forearm with the same detached practicality she had shown examining her shoulder weeks earlier. "You threw a live grenade back at armed combatants without a moment's hesitation," Vrix said slowly, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to awe. "You have never handled a live grenade in your life. How did you know exactly how to grip it, exactly how much force to use?" "I've thrown things that could kill me if I hesitated my whole life, sir," Mara said simply. The shape was different. The principle wasn't. Vrix looked down at the 4 subdued attackers, then back at the young woman standing beside him, blood on her sleeve, breathing steady, utterly unshaken by what had just happened. He thought about his own words to her weeks earlier, shouted in frustration in his office. "This is training, not war." He thought about her calm, certain answer. "You're wrong." Standing in the smoke and silence of the courtyard, surrounded by evidence of a genuine attack that could have ended very differently without her, Vrix finally understood, completely and without reservation, exactly how right she had been. Nearby, one of the incapacitated attackers stirred, groaning as consciousness returned. Vrix moved quickly to secure him, binding his hands with practiced efficiency, while Mara kept watch on the breached gate, in case the 2 who had fled decided to return with reinforcements of their own. The bound man glared up at Vrix, then let his gaze drift toward Mara, confusion flickering across his face. "She's a cadet," he muttered, disbelief thick in his voice despite the pain. "We had reports. Training facility, low security, minimal live combat experience among the trainees. She's not supposed to move like that." "She's not like the others," Vrix said simply, offering no further explanation. The attacker shook his head slowly, wincing. Where did the coalition even find someone like her? Mara did not answer him. She kept her eyes on the gate, her stance still alert despite the fight having ended, old habits refusing to relax simply because the immediate danger had passed. On her homeworld, a threat was never truly over the moment it appeared to end. Storms sometimes doubled back. Predators sometimes returned for a second attempt once the element of surprise was gone. Vigilance did not switch off simply because the loudest part of the danger had quieted. Vrix finished securing the second attacker and straightened, following her gaze toward the gate. "You think they'll come back?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know," Mara admitted, "but I'd rather be wrong about watching than wrong about not watching." More footsteps echoed from the far side of the courtyard as reinforcements finally arrived, Academy security forces moving in to secure the breach and account for casualties. Vrix raised a hand to signal their position, then turned back to Mara one last time before the chaos of the aftermath swallowed them both. "Cadet Voss," he said quietly, and something in his voice had shifted entirely from the sergeant who had shouted at her in frustration weeks earlier. "Thank you. For my life. And for theirs." He gestured toward the dormitory block where the other cadets remained safely sheltered. Mara simply nodded, the smallest flicker of something unfamiliar crossing her tired, steady expression, something that might have been the beginning of pride, or perhaps simply relief, that the instincts her homeworld had carved into her had finally been allowed to protect someone other than herself. Neither of them spoke again as the security team swept in around them, but the silence between them now carried an understanding that no amount of shouted lectures or formal training reports could have ever produced. 3 days after the attack, the Academy's main assembly hall was packed with cadets, instructors, and senior coalition officials who had traveled from the capital to review what had happened and, more importantly, to understand why a training facility with minimal live defenses had survived a coordinated assault virtually unscathed. Mara sat near the back of the hall, still uncomfortable with the attention that had followed her since the courtyard fight, while officials at the front reviewed security footage and cross-examined instructors about the sequence of events. She watched Sergeant Vrix Doran stand at the podium, his posture different than she remembered from their first meeting weeks earlier, less rigid, less certain of the boundaries he had once defended so firmly. The Academy's current doctrine treats training and combat as fundamentally separate categories, Vrix said, addressing the assembled officials with a steadiness that surprised even him. "We teach caution in simulations. We teach recruits to trust that mistakes made during practice carry limited consequences. That approach has served the Coalition well for generations, against enemies whose strength we could reliably predict." He paused, glancing briefly toward the back of the hall where Mara sat, and something like gratitude passed across his weathered face. "It failed us 3 nights ago," he continued, "not because our cadets lacked skill, but because none of them, myself included, had ever been trained to respond instinctively, rather than procedurally, when the line between drill and genuine danger, disappeared entirely. One cadet in this academy did not experience that failure, because where she comes from, that line never existed to begin with. Murmurs rippled through the assembled officials. Several turned to look toward Mara, who kept her expression carefully neutral despite the sudden weight of attention. Cadet Mara Voss single-handedly neutralized two hostile combatants and disrupted an organized assault using instincts that no simulation in this academy's history has managed to replicate. Brix continued, I believe that is not because she is naturally gifted beyond the rest of our recruits. I believe it is because her homeworld gave her something our training programs have never successfully taught, the certainty that danger deserves full commitment every single time, regardless of the label attached to the exercise. After the assembly, a senior coalition official, an older woman named Ingrid Solveig, with sharp eyes and a reputation for blunt honesty, approached Mara privately in the hallway outside the main hall. Cadet Voss, she said, extending a hand that Mara shook carefully, still unused to the formality expected of her in coalition circles. Sergeant Doran has recommended you for an accelerated program, one that doesn't currently exist within our standard curriculum. He wants to build a training module around the instincts your homeworld gave you, something that could genuinely reshape how this academy prepares soldiers for real conflict, rather than simulated versions of it. I'm not sure I understand what that would involve, Mara admitted. Neither do we, entirely. Not yet, Ingrid said, a faint smile crossing her face. That's rather the point. You would work alongside experienced instructors, including Sergeant Doran, to help design training scenarios that eliminate the false comfort of the line between practice and real danger. Not to make training more dangerous for its own sake, but to make it honest, to prepare recruits for the reality that threats do not announce themselves as drills or genuine emergencies before they arrive. Mara considered this carefully, thinking of her father's patient, relentless lessons, throwing weighted stones, until her instincts outpaced her conscious thought, thinking of her mother's calm insistence that the planet owed no one safety, only the chance to earn survival through constant vigilance. She thought of Priya Hendricks, lost to 15 careless minutes years earlier, and of the countless small lessons that had shaped her into someone capable of ending a real attack without hesitation. I'd like to try, she said finally, if it means fewer people end up unprepared when a real threat finds them. Over the following months, Mara worked closely alongside Sergeant Doran to reshape sections of the Academy's training doctrine, drawing on hard lessons from a planet the wider galaxy had long dismissed as unsurvivable and therefore irrelevant. Together they designed scenarios that removed the comfortable certainty cadets once relied upon, exercises where the difference between simulation and genuine consequence blurred just enough to force real instinct rather than rehearsed procedure. It was not an easy transition. Many instructors resisted the changes, arguing that removing the safety net of clearly defined training boundaries risked genuine harm to cadets who were, after all, still learning. Vrix found himself defending Mara's methods in meeting after meeting, drawing on the memory of a courtyard filled with smoke and gunfire to make his case whenever doubt crept into the discussions. We nearly lost this entire academy because we trusted a line that doesn't actually exist, he told a room of skeptical senior instructors during one particularly heated debate. I shouted those very words at Cadet Voss myself, weeks before that attack. This is training, not war. I believed it completely. I was wrong, and it very nearly cost every person in this building their life. Slowly, gradually, the resistance softened. Cadets who trained under the new methods began showing measurable improvements in real crisis response, their reaction times faster, their decision-making calmer, under genuine pressure rather than merely rehearsed pressure. Word spread beyond the academy to other coalition training facilities, curious about the changes and the unusual young woman credited with inspiring them. One afternoon, a few months into the new program, Mara found herself working directly with Oren Vask, the same broad-shouldered Draxian cadet who had once tried to pull her toward cover during the drone malfunction that started everything. He had struggled under the revised curriculum at first, his instincts still tied to the old comfort of knowing a drill would never truly hurt him. I keep hesitating, he admitted to her during a break between exercises, frustration plain on his face. I know the danger in the scenario isn't real, but some part of my mind still treats it like it's fully safe, and by the time I catch myself, I've already lost half a second I shouldn't have lost. That hesitation isn't a flaw, Mara told him, recalling her father's patient voice from a lifetime of thrown stones and bruised palms. It's just an untrained habit. Your mind is still choosing to believe there's a safe category and a dangerous category, and it's taking time to unlearn that. It took me my whole childhood to build the instinct you're trying to build in a few months. Be patient with yourself, but don't stop pushing against it. How do I push against something I can't consciously control? Oren asked. Repetition, Mara said simply, not thinking your way past it, practicing your way past it, over and over, until your body stops waiting for your mind's permission to react. That's all instinct really is. A decision made so many times it stops feeling like a decision at all. Over the following weeks, she noticed Oren's hesitation shrinking, his reactions sharpening under the pressure of scenarios designed to blur the line he had once relied upon so completely. It was small progress, incremental, and hard-won, but it was real, and it reminded her why the changes she and Vrix had fought so hard to implement mattered beyond her own experience alone. 6 months after the attack, Mara stood once again in the same training dome where her academy journey had truly begun, though the space around her looked different now. New equipment lined the walls, designed collaboratively with her input, meant to simulate the unpredictable, relentless nature of genuine danger rather than the carefully bounded challenges of traditional drills. Below her, on the training floor, a new class of first-year cadets ran through an early version of the revised curriculum, their instructors watching closely for the small, telling signs of hesitation that the old system had never successfully addressed. Mara watched a young Draxian cadet stumble through a difficult exercise, freezing for a crucial half-second before recovering, and made a quiet note to discuss adjusted pacing with the instructor overseeing that group later. Sergeant Doran approached and stood beside her at the railing, watching the same scene below with an expression far more open than the guarded skepticism he had once shown her during their first meeting. "They're improving faster than the old curriculum ever produced," he said, a note of genuine satisfaction in his voice. 3 months in, and their crisis response times already rival cadets who trained twice as long under the previous system. "They still have a long way to go," Mara said, though there was no criticism in her tone, only the same practical honesty she had carried since her first day at the academy. Real instinct takes years to build properly. What we're doing here is a start, not a finished solution. "A start is more than this academy had before you arrived," Brick said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the cadets below continue their exercise, before speaking again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I owe you an apology, Cadet Voss. A proper one, not just the thanks I gave you in that courtyard." Mara turned to look at him, curious despite herself. "I judged you the moment I read your file," Vrix continued. "I assumed a homeworld classified as unsurvivable meant chaos, meant a lack of discipline, perhaps even instability. I could not have been more wrong. What your world gave you was not a lack of order. It was a deeper, harder-earned discipline than anything this academy has ever managed to teach through simulation alone. I dismissed that possibility because it did not fit comfortably within what I believed I understood about training soldiers." "You changed your mind," Mara said simply. "That matters more than getting it right the first time, sir." Vrix allowed himself something rare, a genuine, tired smile. "Perhaps, though I suspect your homeworld would have little patience for slow learners." "It wouldn't," Mara agreed, a faint, answering smile touching her own face, the first real smile Vrix had seen from her since the day they met. "But I've found the galaxy out here is a little more forgiving than home ever was. People get second chances more easily. I'm still adjusting to that." Below them, the training exercise concluded, and the young cadets filed out of the dome, tired but visibly more confident than when they had entered, carrying with them the first small pieces of an instinct that would, over time, and with careful cultivation, help prepare them for dangers no simulation could ever fully replicate. Vrix watched them go, then glanced once more at the young woman standing beside him, a soldier the Academy's old systems would never have known how to properly measure, shaped entirely by a planet the rest of the galaxy had long since given up trying to understand. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm glad the Coalition found you before something less fortunate did." Mara considered his words for a long moment, watching the dome's lights dim slightly as the day's training concluded, thinking of the Deathworld she had left behind, of the family who had taught her every hard lesson that had brought her to this exact moment, standing beside a man who had once shouted at her in frustration, and now stood beside her in genuine respect. "So am I," she said finally, and meant it completely. Outside the dome, two suns began their slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden light across an academy quietly, permanently changed by the arrival of a girl who had never known the comfortable lie of a line between training and war, and who had, in the end, taught an entire institution the difference between surviving danger and truly understanding it.